Okay, we're here for another ClueCon Weekly. I love doing these ClueCon Weeklies. It's always a lot of fun. And it's going to be extra special fun this time round because we've got industry veteran and all-round good guy, Alan Percy. Hello there, Alan. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, David, and I'm so glad to have you as host.
Well, thank you. We've been friends a long time, Alan, and we've seen each other around the industry over the years, and so this is a pleasure to have a chat. And with you being recently promoted over at Telco Bridges as well.
Yeah, very fortunate to have connected with Telco Bridges a couple of years ago and took on some new responsibility a few months back and have been given the role of Chief Marketing Officer. So I'm still pinching myself a little bit saying, oh my goodness. So yes, it's been a lot of fun and we're having a good time with it.
Great stuff. And I know in the past that you've worked for companies from over in Israel and in other parts of the US. Anything different with working with a company based out of Canada?
Yes, my pathetic high school French is suddenly coming to the surface. So that's probably the big difference.
Très bon. Bien sûr.
Exactly. Yes. So.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, it's good to have you along. Can you tell us a little bit about Telco Bridges and what you're doing at the moment before we get onto the topic in hand?
Sure. Well, Telco Bridges, of course, and we've got a slide on my deck about this, but in a nutshell, company was founded in 2002. Primarily, has been building media gateways or technology to enable those media gateways. Very large-scale, high-density media gateways using service provider applications. Done some signaling gateways, and about 2 years ago started a line of session border controller software, and that's about where I came on board to help them with the marketing for the session border controllers. Virtualized software-based SBC. It's a product of some of the work that they've done with their SIP stack and security technology that went into the media gateway. So out of the gate was very high performance. And we've been basically spreading the word and helping developers and cloud applications build new networks with our new session border controller. So it's been a lot of fun, a lot of excitement, and of course still driving media gateway and signaling gateway business along as we go. Great
stuff, yeah. And this is something that's particularly well, it's applicable to everybody because it's a very low barrier to entry with the entry-level product being free. And it's been hosted. And I know you had a booth at ClueCon Week, not ClueCon Weekly, at ClueCon itself, didn't you?
Right.
Last August, we were together in
Chicago. Yep.
Good stuff. Now, before you do jump into your presentation, I also happen to know a bit of insider knowledge that you're based up in upstate New York. Tell us about your weather there right now.
Sure. Well, I live in Orchard Park, New York, which is south of Buffalo, which is home of the Buffalo Bills, who are surprising us this year with actually a reasonable performance. And yeah, we've got about 4 or 5 inches of snow on the ground at this point in the mid-December, which is pretty normal for us. But knowing Buffalo weather, it'll all melt for Christmas, and we'll have green mud for Christmas, and then we'll get probably then obviously winter proper will set in January timeframe. So
nice.
It is, as I say, I live on the North Coast, and obviously we're right on the border with Canada here in Buffalo.
Nice and cold, and that's all the better reason for nipping down to Fort Lauderdale sometime in February.
Exactly, and it is. It's
I'm
precisely.
sure we'll talk a little bit about that at the back end of our time together when we'll mention what's going on. But right now, I believe you do have a presentation lined up for us. So I'm going to pop your screen share on. And so there you are. You're up in the top corner.
Good.
Would you like to be in the bottom corner to start with?
Well, I'm actually going to mute my video. You don't need to see me anymore.
Okay.
Let me mute my video there. And I think I have to change my speaker too. So let's go with that. Okay. Well, yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, one of the things that did happen at ClueCon in Chicago is I delivered this presentation about STIR shaken, a quick tutorial on the framework and battling robocallers. It's A very popular topic. A lot of folks have asked about it. We've seen a lot of traffic on our YouTube channel about it. So I thought it would be a good topic to talk to the open source community about, to help them understand what does all this change mean and how they're impacted by the changes in what's coming with the STIR Shaken framework. So let's move on. So what I wanted to start with, of course, is I've just a quick introduction, and this is my contact information. It'll be in the deck if you're interested. But I'd obviously love to have everyone who listens in to connect up with me on LinkedIn. Just search for me, Alan D. Percy, and you find me. Love to have you as a follower on Twitter too. But also too, we host a podcast called Telecom Disruptors. And this is a regular contribution to the people that have disrupted the market and the technology that goes with it. So it's good fun. Moving on, it's a little bit about Telco Bridges, as I mentioned. Founded in 2002. It's I think we're about 40 people at this point now, based outside of Montreal. And I gave you a little bit of the history of the company already, but we're also have offices in Poland, Turkey, and Hong Kong. And to do 24/7 support. So a very dedicated, committed, focused team. So let's talk about the battle against robocalling and some of the steps involved. So a quick agenda here. We just want to start with just a quick problem overview, some of the impact of the fraud. We'll talk about what's happening in the regulatory front, because that's important. And when we get to it, we'll talk about why regulatory is so important. Well, then we'll move on and talk about the technology, the STIR Shaken framework and how it works, ways to actually implement it, and then we can have some time at the end, David, maybe for a little discussion on the impact on the open source community.
Yeah, fine. That's fine.
Yep. So robocalling here in the States is, it's been a persistent problem. This is an example of what we're kind of suffering from, which is, your phone rings, and you look at it, it's an 800 number, it says it's the IRS from Washington, D.C., and of course, most people would think, oh my gosh, what's this all about? And if you answered this call, you would hear probably a pre-recorded voice or maybe a text-to-speech voice say, this is Internal Revenue Service calling about an issue in a recent payment. Hold the line or press 1 or something like that. And you would be transferred to, and I'm using air quotes here, agent, and instead you would end up talking to a scammer. This is definitely a scam.
Man,
and
I
they
hate
would,
those scams.
yes. Unfortunately, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, these things tend to go in cycles. Over here, we had a lot of scam calls about automobile accidents not so long ago. People would ring up and they'd say, this is about the accident you were involved in. And they'd try and reel you in that way. What's flavor of the month over there at the minute? Yeah,
the flavor of the month right now in the States here is twofold. One of them is about your extended warranty on your car, which has become a running joke. It's nonstop. I don't know, whoever's trying to sell those extended warranties, or they're selling sham extended warranties is what's happening. And the other one is that somehow your Social Security number has been put on hold because of some violation or something like that, which is really just a way for somebody to scrape your identity. So they've been particularly nasty. And matter of fact, there's some statistics here on this slide. Back in 2013, which is an eternity ago in this particular problem, the Treasury Inspector General reported that some 10,000 victims paid $54 million because of these phone scams just in that 1 year. So it's a really nasty problem that's financially really been negatively impactful to a lot of people and starting to hurt people. And so just kind of distilling down the problem, I think a lot of folks feel it firsthand, but looking at it from a wider lens, it's we've more recently been reported that from UMail reported there's been 5.7 billion unwanted robocalls just in October, and that number continues to grow. Seems like month over month. We had put together a number of years ago these do not call lists, and they just aren't working. Basically, the bad guys completely ignore them. And then on top of it all, the perpetrators have started using this technique. I think you've probably all seen it, called neighbor spoofing, which is where they use a telephone number that's similar to yours, And so you think, well, it might be a friend or a family member or somebody in the neighborhood, and you answer the call, and that has been worsening. And then some of the crowdsource, I call it robocall prevention systems, and there's some common ones, or No More Robo and a few others. What's happening is that because they're using your phony caller ID when they're calling other people, is that your number ends up getting on one of these blocking services, and then you can't even you try to call people and you can't call people because your number has managed to get on this blacklist. So it's a particularly nasty problem that's getting worse and worse. And of course, a lot of people have been complaining to Congress and trying to get some action for years on it. And it spurred a series of legislation. One of the few cases of our two houses of Congress actually cooperating has been on this front. And our friends at TransNexus provided this really nice chart that shows the history of some of the legislation that's happened. But in the beginning, it was simple. It said, oh, we're going to create a Do Not Call Act, and you're not allowed to do it. Well, the problem is the perpetrators are outside the country, so the act basically didn't do anything. And then moving along, then falsifying your contact information became illegal, which again, the guys outside the country completely ignored that. And then things started to come together, which is putting together the STIR, Shake, and framework based on in an effort called the Robo Strike Force. And then the FCC stepped in, the Canadian CRTC stepped in, and the STIR, Shake, and framework eventually was declared the method to validate caller ID and to provide some protection to consumers in the U.S. And more recently, one of the biggest things is that the FCC allowed blocking of calls. Until that point, they had to deliver the calls, even if they knew they were falsified. They had to deliver them, and so now that's made a difference. And then, very recently, the House passed what's called the Trace Act, and I would love to get into that in detail, but you can certainly Google that and look up what the details of that are. So things are progressing quickly, much more quickly now, and it's mostly because of all the consumer complaints. It's been number one complaint to the FCC for a long, long time, and things are starting to finally move.
Yeah. Now, before we just leave this slide, and let's just give a quick shout out to TransNexus, and in particular our friend Jim Dalton down there, another good industry guy.
Yep, absolutely. Jim and Alec, his sidekick, have done a phenomenal job, and they've obviously been very helpful in coming up with some of these solutions. And we'll as we go through it, you'll see where they fit in the overall puzzle. Okay, so one area that I think is very important is to explain, what were the real goals of the STIR, Shake, and framework. And first of all, there's two audiences. One of them is the consumer. The idea is to build for the consumer to rebuild confidence in caller ID. People basically at this point, you can't trust the caller ID that comes up on your phone, and we want to restore that trust, right? And to give you the information to know whether or not you can trust a number that's calling you, or if it's potentially spoofed. This also enables screening and some verification tools. And basically, in the nutshell, is to put some kind of trust in a public telephone network. Again, it's people are cutting the cord, they're moving on to just mobile only environments, but there's still a huge demand for the public telephone network. Despite WhatsApp and Skype and all the other applications and Facebook Messenger, there are just some services you have to use over the public network, and it's important to be able to trust that. Moving over to the law enforcement side, though, is one of the key things is it provides a means to trace the origin of these illegal and fraudulent calls. And that's one of the core problems with the current environment. When we get to some of the animations in a couple of slides, you'll see why that is. Calls will often hop through 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 wholesale providers before they get to your retail provider who delivers the service to maybe your cell phone. And it's very difficult to trace any one particular call back to its origin because of all those hops through the wholesale network. There's a means as part of this to actually go back and not only find what was the source of the call, but to do some record keeping that could be used in prosecution. and create a deterrent, right?
Right.
Security cameras on buildings create a tremendous deterrent because people know they're being watched. So
right. But I guess what some people would want to know at this stage, Alan, is how does it actually go about blocking these calls that people don't want?
yeah, as a matter of fact, that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions. The STIR shaken itself doesn't block any calls. All it does is provide a mechanism to say that this caller ID can be trusted or not. And that's an important building block on then later downstream building applications that use analytics to decide whether or not to let this call proceed or to block it. And
Right.
those, I was going to say, in those applications using analytics are typically under the guise of TDOS, or telephony denial of service, to prevent that kind of attack on people.
Right. Okay. But I guess another question would be, how quickly is it established from the sort of inception of a phone call that as to whether the caller ID can be trusted or not?
Yeah, this whole process, when we get through it, actually only takes a few milliseconds. It's not a very complex computational process.
Right.
If anything, the issues now, and just having spent a week at the SIPNOC conference talking about this, the issues now is just adoption. And when we get to the end of the slide deck, we'll talk about some of the the milestones in adoption that's happened more recently. So getting people to actually implement this and use this has been the hurdle at this point. Okay, so let's move on. Let's just talk about where do these robocalls all come from and what's the source of them. And it turns out, if you look at the typical telephone call from a robocaller, it starts on the left here from the robocaller themselves, and what they're going to do is they're going to initiate a call with some falsified caller ID. This might be international, it'll be overseas, almost always overseas, almost always using maybe a SIP trunk or some of those TDM cards, the old Dialogic or Digium cards. They're going to drop a call onto to their originating service provider. And today, until some of this STIR shaken stuff happens, that service provider would just pass that call along, assuming that the originator of the call had permission to use that caller ID. They just pass it on as is. It goes through all the wholesale operators as is, ends up at your destination service provider, which might be your wireless operator, and who just passes it along as is, and that's why you end up with this falsified caller ID on your mobile device or your home phone. Honestly, this robocall platform probably is built on some open source technology, and it's one of the sort of funny, unfortunate side effects of what we've done with making telephone calls dirt cheap and making open source software platforms is it's very, very easy to build these robocallers.
Right. Yeah. So it's like one of these technologies that can be used for good or for no good, and
right.
Sadly, some of the bad guys have got hold of it.
Yep. And unfortunately, they can make a lot of noise and cause people a lot of trouble. So I would say, if anything, to the open source community, it's probably incumbent on them to help solve some of this by being responsible at the far end of this. So I don't know if you're a consultant, for example, and you're helping someone build an application, it would be wise to sort of say, what are you doing with this before you contribute to worsening the problem? So, okay, so let's move on and talk about the terminology. Where does this STIR shaken come from, other than James Bond movies? I have to nod my chapeau to whomever took this these acronyms and came up with plucked these letters out of their descriptions and came up with STIR and shaken. It's very creative.
It's a work of art.
Yes, it's a bit of a puzzle. But STIR, it's just the biggest thing is there's two elements to it. We talk about the two. STIR is about securing the telephony identity, right? So it's actually a chunk of encrypted, and we call it an identity token often. And when we go through the rest of the slides, you'll see it's an identity token, a STIR identity token. So it's basically an encrypted token that gets attached to a call. The process of passing it from place to place, from the origin to the destination, is actually shaken, the secure handling of asserted information using tokens. And when we go through the process, you'll see how these two work together, and which is why we always talk about them together, STIR shaken, plus it sounds cool, and plus, like at SIPNOC last week, we had a martini party to celebrate a milestone with Stir Shaken. So, hey, I'll do anything for a drink at this point. So how does it work? When a caller makes a call on a SIP trunk, what's going to happen is they're going to insert, they would like to have some caller ID associated with it. Now, it may be their provided caller ID from the originating service provider, but remember, it also may be a caller ID that they've been assigned. This might be a service provider who's providing notification service, and they have permission to use a caller ID, not necessarily their own, but somebody else's. They've got permission. And what's going to happen is that the originating service provider is going to, quote unquote, attest to the ownership of the caller ID. And this attestation, as it's called, or attesting to the ownership, is a critical piece of it. That originating service provider needs to say, yes, I believe that this person is who they say they are, and they have permission to use that caller ID, which creates obviously tremendous complexities, but for now, let's just leave it at that. So that originating service provider now creates a STIR token, identity token, and attaches it to the call, and they actually bury it into the SIP header, and it gets passed along to the wholesale operators as is. Hopefully, the wholesale operators don't strip it off, or one of their SBCs doesn't strip it off, or it doesn't get lost in a soft switch. And then it gets to the destination service provider, who then opens that STIR token, then goes out and gets a gets a public key to decrypt it and validates it, and then can pass that caller ID along to the consumer and say, this is a valid caller ID, and you can trust that this caller ID is correct and proper. So that's in a nutshell how it's supposed to work.
That information, Alan, would end up, so say you received your call on a mobile phone, you'd actually see something like maybe a little green padlock or something to indicate that it's a valid.
Yes, exactly. As a matter of fact, in a couple of slides, I've got a little picture of that. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So a little bit more detail how this authentication works. So again, the originating service provider, if it is one of their customers, will give it full attestation. And attestation comes in 3 levels: A, B, and C. If it's a subscriber for the service provider, he'll give it full attestation with an A. If it's a trunk group, for example, or they're not 100% sure, but they believe it's correct, it's kind of and there's a definition of what to be attestation in the ATTEST specification, but the best way to think of it is a trunk group number. Was partial, you would give it a B, but if you have no idea where this call came from, except it arrived at maybe your international gateway port, and you have little trust in it, you would give it an attestation C. So basically, A is good, B is and C is I have no idea where this came from. But I'm still going to sign it because it gives important information for downstream, and we'll talk about that. So the originating service provider is going to then create this identity token and attach it to the SIP invite, and then pass it along as it goes. So. And here's just another little diagram of this here. So in the bottom left here, this is the originating calling party on a service provider, which is the big kind of ovally shaped in the right here. In most cases, there's a session border controller in that originating service provider, either the ingress or egress SBC. And in the case here, we're using our Pro SBC. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna pass this invite, and this is how we work with TransNexus. We pass it up to their cloud-based authentication service, which is called ClearIP. And what they do is they go to their key store, and they create this level of attestation based on some rules within their platform, and then send back this identity token to the session border controller. And the SBC then forwards that invite along to for example, the wholesale operator network, now with this embedded identity token. And I'll show you here in just a couple of seconds what it looks like.
Okay.
It's a lot of moving parts here, but between us and TransNexus, we figured it out. So this is what it looks like. This is what a STIR identity token looks like when it's unencrypted, which is basically a little header saying, how it's encrypted, what it's like, along with where can you get the certificate to decrypt it. And then, of course, the payload, and it comes with the attestation level, in this case A. the destination number where it's trying to go, the origin, I'm sorry, the timestamp, I skipped over that. Then the origin telephone number, the calling and called number. And then this nifty thing called the Orig ID. The Orig ID is the secret sauce, because the Orig ID is a unique number for this call and only this call, and it can be used for traceback. And this is a critical thing for that public safety, or for the FBI or whomever to trace back a call by logging these numbers at the origin. The bad guys' calls can be traced back to where they're coming into the network, and at least it gives eliminates a lot of the work.
Because that Orig ID somehow is attached to a geographic or an IP identity.
Correct. Exactly. Yep.
Right.
So that identity token, of course, gets encrypted. ES256 compressed and sent along the way. That's what it would actually look like in a SIP invite. Is a glob of gunk like that, but it has the certificate at the bottom that could be used to decrypt this. Okay. So now let's move to the terminating service provider, the other end of the puzzle. A call arrives. It can see that it was signed. What it's going to do then is extract that call info we just talked about. Pull the info out of the SIP header, go get the public key, and use that public key to decrypt it. And then based on that, can then do some verification on the caller ID, and then it can relay the fact to the consumer that the caller ID was unmolested and actually is attested to, or the level of attestation. Okay.
Right.
So kind of a block diagram. This is the terminating service provider. Bottom left, call arrives from the wholesale network. Again, on most service providers, those arrive at some ingress session border controller, and again, we can play this role with our Pro SBC. This we send over to TransNexus's verification service. Again, it's in the cloud. Who goes to the certificate repository to go retrieve the certificate, decrypts it, and validates it, and sends back what's called a verstat, and that's the verification status. And that we relay that in the SIP header in the invite and pass it along to the called party. So you can imagine a PBX or an IVR platform or a contact center would now know that this call had a valid STIR identity token attached to it, and the caller ID can be trusted. At that point, you can do all kinds of things. You can screen calls, you can block them, you can just dump the call if it's not, whatever you choose based on analytics from there.
Yeah, you're building your logic based on the outcome of this process.
Correct. And that's where a lot of the community, I believe a lot of the free switch and SignalWire community is probably going to benefit from this, because now at this point, if they can see that verstat, they know that they can trust the caller ID or not, and it'll help with a lot of decisions down the road. So as you said, what's the user experience like? Newstar, for example, came up with a couple of ideas, and they proposed, that this kind of visual information. I know Verizon has started to implement some spam graphics on their mobile phones, but also too, the opposite can be true. That you could deliver, now that you can trust the caller ID, you can do things like, put more information on the screen. You can say, okay, if I know this caller ID, I can do things to the web. I can collect information and present a much more consumer-friendly caller ID instead of just a number and a name. You can go get information off the web, for example. So really will change the user experience, especially on mobile devices. But digital SIP-based handsets in businesses or mobile clients or soft clients will have opportunities to do all kinds of things.
Yeah, I guess in the fullness of time, we could probably do distinctive ringing based on the estimation of whether it's valid or not.
Absolutely. Well, some news that's literally hot off the press here just a couple of days ago on December 9th. Our FCC Chairman Pai and the CRTC Chairman Scott completed their first international authenticated STIR shaking call between two operators, Xfinity in the States and TELUS across the border. A huge milestone. Some of the other operators, AT&T and T-Mobile, have been doing trials, passing call information back and forth. There's some other related news that the governance authority has been assigned, which is now starting to give out policy administrator rights and then certificate authority rights. As a matter of fact, I just saw that TransNexus was also granted a certificate authority status. So there's lots happening. It's happening very quick, and a lot of this implementation is finally coming together much more quickly. So moving on to kind of a related topic, sort of things that are evolving, and this is some of the work that came out of this last week's SIPNOC, is, what about TDM networks, or what about networks that somehow crush the SIP identity header, that was passed through the wholesale network? How can we get this STIR token from the originating provider to the destination provider? And we've been doing some work with TransNexus and some other partners in this technology called out-of-band STIR. And the idea being is that the caller initiates a call that the originating service provider might be a TDM service provider, so they might be using gateways instead of SBCs. That gateway would then be using the same methodology to create a STIR token. And instead of putting it back in the invite, because remember, if it's going to leave the service provider on TDM, there's no way to pack that STIR token into the header. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go out to what's called a call placement service, and we're going to drop the STIR token in the call placement service, which is kind of an independent third party parked out in the cloud. And then the call is going to progress as is, just a TDM call. And then the terminating service provider can then go out to the call placement service and pick up that STIR token and validate the call based on the timestamp and the called number and all the rest of the information, and provide the same level of confirmation to their consumers as the in-band STIR that we showed previously. And this is work in progress, and there's a lot of debate about where should the call placement service be, and et cetera. But it is coming, and it gives hope to those TDM service providers that are looking for a solution to be not only compliant with this requirement, but also to give some quality of service to their customers downstream. Exciting days, a lot going on. So, in the net of the whole thing, is with just some of the benefits of doing STIR shaking and participating in it. Start with something similar. The customers can't be fooled with a fake caller ID. It's going to improve the likelihood of answering calls when they're signed and are shown as the green check mark or the verification status. We think it'll improve the call completion rates for outbound callers. For people who are doing proper legal robocalling, notification applications, reminder calls, these kinds of things, which will help the carriers generate more revenue. It'll help them also implement call screening and capture-like applications, which we think will block some of the illegal robocalling. And the carriers must participate by mandate from the FCC and the CRTC. And this was written into the rules by both the FCC and the CRTC. So this is all coming, and it's coming quickly.
Do you see, Alan, this being a chargeable service?
That's actually one of the areas that's sort of interesting debate. The service providers are. Let me just get back to that. The service providers are. They're being mandated to do this without passing, a specific cost along to the customer. However, there are a couple of places where there is a revenue opportunity in that, which is in this ability to refer for example, you're a large business like, let's say, Walmart, and Walmart wants to hire a contractor to make legal calls to their customers. Obviously, they want to be able to use Walmart's callback number. So that process of deferring my number over to a service provider potentially is something that could be billed. There are a few other places where it could be billed, but it mostly is going to be incented by preventing further erosion in trust in the public network and by mandate from the FCC and the CRTC. So it doesn't appear at this point that the service providers are going to use this as a cash machine, or it's going to be optional per se. However, those downstream applications we talked about, remember the validation applications, the TDOS protection applications, those are opportunities for revenue. So,
right.
Yep. It's interesting next steps on that.
Yeah. Indeed.
All right.
Sorry, I asked that question and you were just about to tell us more about free SBC.
Yeah, I want to move on and just kind of give a little more detail about what we offer. We have 2 platforms, Free SBC and Pro SBC. Free SBC is obviously it's a free session border controller software package that can be used for a lot of applications. We've had tremendous response, some 10 million sessions downloaded and used, with great community support, and it's free to use, free for an annual renewal. However, what we've been talking about leverages some features that are in our Pro SBC, which is targeted towards service providers, software as a service applications, commercial applications. It comes with encryption and HA support, along with live technical support and optional 24/7 support. It's only $1 a session a year, so if someone could put together a 500 session service, it would cost them $500 a year to operate it with standard support, or for an extra $1 a year per session, for $2 a session, they can have full 24/7 support. So a very cost-effective piece of the puzzle, and obviously the other elements like the TransNexus piece would come from them.
Right.
So one of the things I wanted to point out too is we have tremendous interoperability with the SBC software, including FreeSwitch, Asterisk, 3CX, TransNexus, a lot of the other players here on the slide, and I wish I could cram even more in. But these are the kinds of players that we've been doing interoperability with. And I wanted to kind of wrap up with an opportunity to folks to start to work with us. They can go to our freesbc.com and download FreeSBC, and that gives them a 90-day, I forgot to put the word day in there, 90-day Pro SBC trial. We've got all kinds of frequently asked questions on our forums at forums.freesbc.com, and a tremendous library of I think 40 videos and webinars that we've recorded at this point on our video library.
Personally benefited from watching some of those videos, Alan.
Yes, I know when you worked on our little Asterisk integration video,
Right.
you had mentioned that came in handy. And of course, most importantly is in February, we're headed to the Open Source World event, which Dave, you're being host and key put together.
I've just put us back onto video, Alan.
Great.
You can.
Yeah, let me unmute my video.
Do we need that screen anymore, or was that?
No, that was pretty much it.
Yeah.
Yep. So, yes, we've got some great plans for January or February. That's going to be looking forward to participating and providing even more detail on this, for example, in one of the speaking sessions that got planned. So,
indeed,
it's a great opportunity.
The 12th to 14th of February in Fort Lauderdale. Yep. There are worse places that you can be in February than Fort Lauderdale, I can assure you.
Yes.
And we're going to enjoy talking about open source solutions at that event. It's a track at the IT Expo event, and I know that we've already secured your speaking services there, Alan, and Tony from FreeSwitch and SignalWire, Tony Minisali, will also be speaking there. I believe we've got the lovely Alison, the voice of Asterisk and FreeSwitch and various other things involved as well. So and Fred Posner. There's going to be quite a few people down there. So
it'd be great
to catch some good industry speakers there.
Yep, I saw the list, and I'm excited to be part of that event, and we're very much looking forward to it. Matter of fact, we're right in the early stages, but I'm pleased to announce that we are also going to be organized technical training for Pro SBC and Free SBC on the Monday and the Tuesday before the event in Fort Lauderdale, and we're still working on the details of the location, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But people can find that training. I think we just posted on our store, which would be store.telcobridges.com. So if somebody's been working with it, wants to get trained on free and pro SBC, that'd be a great way to not, hit two birds with one stone, right? So you'd be able to do the training on Monday and Tuesday. Wednesday, they can do the training for Free Switch. I guess that Tony's going to be running. And then they've got the open source conference for that whole week too. So I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds like a week of very useful stuff indeed.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, appreciate the time. And Dave, I appreciate your contributions.
Yeah, and it's mutual, Alan. We appreciate you coming on ClueCon weekly, and of course your contribution to the industry in general through associations with a number of different companies over the years, and of course your massive contribution to the world of facts. I couldn't let this opportunity go without mentioning the world of facts.
Yes, well, I have to admit, I got a chuckle out of the other day. Someone talked about secure facts, and I just buried my head in my hands. It's like, oh no, still. So,
great stuff.
Yep, good fun.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing you in person in Fort Lauderdale. But in the meantime, I hope all goes well with you, and I hope you don't get too much snow up there in upstate New York.
I will save you a beach chair down in Florida. How's that?
All right, fair enough. Okay. Thank you very, very much for coming on ClueCon Weekly, Alan.
Look forward to the next time.